All right, students. Yesterday got away from me, but here we are. It's Friday, and this is our wrap up to last week. And again, I really appreciate the dedication and the engagement that I hear when I drop into your group discussions as you're talking and working with each other. I appreciated the effort with the Padlet and coming together to analyze the standards, sharing your questions, sharing the process through which you created the questions. All of this is essential in developing our approach in the social studies classroom. It's not just about the lesson in the classroom or the activity. It is all of the materials that you gather. It's all of the questions that you ask. It's all of the work you do prior to entering the classroom that often makes the difference. And sharing all of your ideas is a part of that. Collaborating and communicating with each other as fellow teachers or teacher candidates, this is essential. Sharing our experiences, growing with and through each other is what a classroom experience is supposed to be. So thank you so much for your dedication and your engagement. Now, we, of course, engage with Eisner. There is an example if you'd like to go back and watch that. We're probably going to watch that later. But this is where we're going. What is inquiry? We are looking at our classrooms as experimental environments for inquiry-based learning. Now, what does that mean in the social studies? We are considering these 4 dimensions of the C3 framework. And right now, what we've been working on are really dimensions 1 and dimensions 2. We're developing questions and planning those inquiries overall. We're thinking about the content, we're thinking about the questions that we can ask or the questions we can develop with students. And then we're starting to think within the specific strands of civics, economics, geography, and history, how do we engage in inquiry in each one? What does an inquiry look like in civics or in economics or geography or history? How do you actively do civics? How do you do history or economics or geography? What does that look like actively? And that's what we're starting to move into now. We've got our philosophical foundation. We're working on our question asking skills. We're developing compelling and supporting questions. And now we start to move into, well, what does that look like actively in the classroom? We also begin to consider dimension 3, the materials, all of the materials we need, the primary documents, the primary sources that we want students to use to answer our compelling questions and our supporting questions in civics, economics, geography, and history. So what counts as evidence in economics? What counts for evidence in civics, depending on the questions that you're asking? And then down the road, we're going to move into the idea of taking informed action, because it's not enough that we leave social studies in the classroom. We have to do something beyond the 4 walls of our classroom. We want our students to communicate their conclusions. Maybe it's through Twitter or Instagram, or maybe it's through a website or a digital product or an infographic. It has to be communicated beyond the classroom to the school, if not the community. How do you do that? We want our students to learn to take informed action. It's not enough to act. That action they take should be informed based on evidence they use to answer a question. And so the inquiry cycle is all tied together. And this is what we're trying to do in the social studies. Another way to look at that might be here, the dimension 1, where you're constructing the questions and you're looking for those sources. Then you're asking yourself, well, how do I do that in the different domains? And here's some examples. And then gathering the evidence and the sources they can use for that evidence, and then thinking about how we can take informed action. We'll come back to this. We'll look at this in depth in the coming weeks. You may have looked at this in the reading. For example, in first grade, the compelling question of how do we know what maps say? It's teacher generated. You've got your supporting questions. What makes a map a map? There's assessment, documentation of conversations, map work samples, rationale used to find treasure. They did a treasure map. The informed action, fire department phone calls or review of the fire exit map. See, that informed action has a purpose. The students are learning about maps and their importance, and they are learning about fire exit maps, and they're making phone calls to the fire department to learn about why it's important to follow those fire exit maps. And so it's not just answering a question, it's taking informed action based on how you answer that question. If you didn't really look at this grid, it is in the reading from last week, and I encourage you to look at it. It kind of lays out a couple of examples for you to start thinking about. That brings us to this week in objectives. So we kind of briefly chatted about those different types of objectives, and I believe that you've learned to write objectives in another class or classes. But we can think of them as behavioral, problem solving, and experiential. Again, the behavioral is a very precise, determined end that you want the students to do and complete. Problem solving is an open-ended objective where the students are going to solve a problem. They're going to engage in the process. And the experiential outcomes are the open-ended, that it's an experience. We're going to experience something, we're going to learn from it, but we don't necessarily know what that experience is going to bring us. And you can start thinking about like simulations or even other decision-making processes that might lend themselves to these types of objectives. I like to use Bloom's taxonomy when I write my objectives. I believe the taxonomic verbs that Bloom's provides helps us to create active learning objectives that are focused on the engagement of students with the material. Allow me to explain a STEM that makes that happen. So this is the way I like to at least begin thinking about objectives. Now, I'm not going to try and say that this is the only way to write objectives, but I think this is a good STEM for you to think about that helps us engage students in an active learning process. My students will X in order to Y, showing Z. The X is Bloom's taxonomy's verb. It's an action. So my students are going to do something. The Y is the learning or the understanding. Now, that learning or understanding might also be a Bloom's taxonomic verb or word. Remember, understanding is not strong enough to be used in our objectives. You may never use the word understanding in your objective. You can never write, my students will understand. We have to do away with that. We want our students to actually do something. And so if I were to go up here, my students will evaluate, my students will apply, my students will remember, my students will create. Or more specific, my students will defend, my students will compare, my students will describe, my students will memorize. Ugh. Let's not memorize anything, okay? My students will X in order to Y. What is it that they're learning? What's that content? What is the fact or the skill that you want them to learn? You'll get this from the standard itself. It will be related to the concept, and it will help answer that compelling question. And then, this is the key part that I think is often left out of objectives. What's the assessment? What's the proof of that learning? So the students are going to do something, to learn something, and then how are they going to show that they learned it? What will they submit to you? What will they create? What will they build? What will they write? What will they sing? What will they record? What will they interpretive dance? How are they going to show you that they learned what they learned by doing what you had them do? This is what I'd like you to try and write your objectives, at least for this first assignment. I want us to try and practice this. My students will X in order to Y, showing Z. And so now we've got that final piece to really writing the top part of our lesson plans. Of course, our process is this. We start with our content, the strands, the concepts. We identify those concepts out of the strands. We make sense of the bigger picture. We don't want to get lost in the weeds. We want to see the forest. We want to be selective, as Lowen asks us to do. We want to identify those questions. We want to start gathering our resources. What are all the things we need to use to teach this in the classroom? And we want to write our objectives. And again, I would like us to try writing objectives like this. My students will X in order to Y, showing Z. Every objective should contain an action. It should contain what they're learning, and it should contain how they're being assessed, or what it is they're going to use to show that they know something. The thing is this: sometimes the X and the Y might be the same thing, and sometimes the Y and the Z are the same thing. And that happens. But let's practice. Let's see how this goes this week. So here is the assignment to wrap up last week. Crash course gap lesson. I want you to go back to that first assignment we did in class. I said, let's visualize the 4 strands. Of those 4 strands, where were you weakest? And I asked you to think about this. Where was your weakest strand? I want you to look at the standards, consider where you're weak, and I want you to pick a standard that you know nothing about. I want you to find an economic standard or a geography standard or a history standard or a civic standard that you know absolutely nothing about. I want you to then go watch a crash course video about it, and I want you to write the first part of a lesson plan about what you just watched. So I'm asking you to go learn something and then write a lesson plan about it. Identify your concept, create a compelling and supporting question, and then write an objective. You've already identified the strand. So you've got you already identified your standard. You've got your standard. You got to identify the concept, the compelling and supporting question. You have to write an objective, and I want you to bring that to class with you. Underneath course modules, Module 4 at the very top was class time materials. Underneath that, there is a lesson plan assignment folder. Inside of that, you will find all of the materials that you need. Here is the little introduction. Here is the link to Crash Course itself. Here's a lesson plan template for you to complete, and this is where you can submit it and also bring to class with you. Crash Course is a collection of videos about just about anything you might need to quickly learn about. So there's economics, European history, government, there's mythology, there's philosophy, psychology, sociology, study skills, U.S. history, World History 2. I want you, again, think about where you're weak. In the standards, find a standard that you don't even like. I don't even know what that is. I have no clue. I'm sure you can find something that you're a little vague about. Watch a crash course video about it. And then I want you to complete just the top part of the lesson plan template. This is not that complex. You don't need to worry about the course taught right now. I ask you for the concept. What are your questions that you're asking, a compelling and a sub-question? What are the objectives, and what's the standard? Don't worry about procedures or assessment. We're not there yet. We're just thinking about this top part. If you have any questions, please email me, and I, of course, will be very quick to respond and answer any and all questions. We can chat about it on the phone. But everybody, I hope you have a good weekend, and I will be back on Monday as we refocus on next week. Thanks, everybody.